Hello and welcome back to an evening with Richard Puffpaff. I'm Richard Puffpaff, and today I have here with me a very special guest, Dr. Leopold Abernathy, Professor of Classical Studies at the University of Cumberland and President of the Classic Society of Europe.
Yes, hello Richard. Thanks so much for having me. It's truly an excruciating honor. It's great to be here. Thank you, Leopold, but please, call me Dick. Oh, righto, Dick, old buddy.
Yes, indeed, it's great to have you here, and I think we should get started.
Yes, absolutely. No more dilly-dally. Time to put our nose to the grindstone, right, old chap? Sure. So, in tonight's segment, we'll be discussing some lyric poems by Horace and Catullus. Yes, indeed. And let me tell you something, Dick. This lyric poetry is truly riveting. Absolutely, gloriously prerogative. It sure is, Leopold. Now, before we really get into the nitty-gritty, I want to take some time to introduce some of the characters and concepts to our listeners, and then we can have a reading of the poems and their translations. That sounds like an absolutely smashing plan, Dick. Really, truly invigorating.
Yes, thank you. So as I'm sure many of our listeners know, lyric poetry was a rebellion against the more grand, epic poetry that was popular at the time. And the lyricists focused much more on emotions, usually love. Isn't that right, Leopold?
Dick, you magnificent bugger, you. The Queen couldn't have said it better herself.
Well, thank you very much. So the poems we'll be discussing today are Catullus's Carmen 5 and Horace's Book 1, Ode 23. And what's particularly interesting about these poems is how similar they are in subject, for both poets are, in their own ways, courting a woman.
You're inconceivably correct, Dick, in that observation, and you should be truly proud of that.
Catullus 5 is addressed to Lesbia, as we know, and as any expert who's worth his weight in tea knows, Lesbia is really a cover name for his true lover, Claudia.
And then Horace, on the other hand, is attempting to court his own lover, Chloe,
who's quite the crumpet, let me tell you. And what makes these poems so blisteringly interesting, so unhygienically confounding, is the fact that, although the poems are devastatingly similar, they're actually quite different as well.
That's very interesting. Well, we'll get right into that, but first, I think, now it would be appropriate to read and translate the poems for our listeners.
You couldn't be more right if you drove on the left side of the road, Dick.
I know, Leopold. I'll start by reading Catullus 5 in meter, and then you can give us a translation.
Viva mus mea lesbia atqua memus, rumoresque senum sueriorum, omnes unius aestimemus assis. Soles ocire ret ledire possunt. Nobis cum semelocidi brevis lux, noxias perpetuuna dormienda. Da mi basia mille dendecentum, den mil altera den secunda centum, dendus qualtera mille dendecentum, den cum milia multa fecerimus, conturbabimus illa nesciamus, aut ne quis malas invidere possit, cum tantum sciat esse basiorum.
Wow, Dick, that was just absolutely, clinically, loyally, confoundingly lovely. I'll read my translation now. Let us live, my Lesbia, and let us love. Let us value all the rumours of more strict old men at one cent. Suns are able to fall and to rise again. When brief light is set once and for all, we must sleep one eternal night. Give to me 1,000 kisses, then 100, then another 1,000, then a second 100, then continuously another 1,000, then 100. Then, when we will have made many thousands, we will confound those, lest we know, or lest anyone bad is able to envy, when he knows that there is so great a number of kisses.
What a beautiful poem that is. Now let's move on to Horace 1.23.
Vita sinuleo, me similis, Chloe, quaerenti pauidam, montibus aviis matrem non sine vano, aurarum et silvae metu, nam sum mobilibus, veris in horuit, adventus voliis, suirides rubum dimu verer acertae, et cordet genibus tremit. Atqui non ego te, tigris ut aspera, cae tu lusve uleo, frangere persequor, tandem de sine matrem tempestivas acquiviro.
Once again, lovely, Dick. Now I'll read the translation.
You avoid me, Chloe, like a fawn, seeking its trembling mother on the pathless mountains, not without a groundless fear of breezes in the forest. For whether the arrival of spring has begun to tremble in the inconsistent leaves, or the green lizards have separated the prickly bush. She trembles, both in her heart and in her knees. But I do not pursue to crush you, as our rough tiger or Gaetulian lion. At last, woman ripe for a man, cease to follow your mother.
Just great. Really, it is. So, let's get started with some analysis, shall we?
I couldn't fathom a world in which I would agree more with you, Dick. So, what strikes me immediately about the poems is the fact that they both are obviously addressed to a lover, but that they are, in reality, taking quite different approaches.
What do you mean, Leopold?
Well, Dick, I guess I mean that the poets are each using very different techniques to court their respective women. Take Catullus 5, for example. Vivamus mea lesbia atquamemos. Let us live, my Lesbia, and let us love. The hortatory subjunctives immediately set a romantic, almost surreal, dreamlike tone that wraps you into this emotional world. Catullus then goes on to ask that Lesbia value the opinions of old men and no more than assent. Catullus is appealing to her wild, irrationally loving side. He wants her to fling away all her hesitancy and trepidation and be with him, no matter what.
Wow, a very astute observation, Leopold.
And this theme seems to continue in the poem when he says, Soles occidere et redire possunt. Suns are able to fall and to rise again. This idea contrasts the love that the two feel for each other. For nobis nox des perpetuuna dormienda. One eternal night must be slept by us. Bob's your uncle. That's marvelously correct, Dick. Catullus is saying that even the sun gets to rise over and over again, but if they deny their love now, they might never get another chance. Yes, it seems that Catullus is appealing to the more Epicurean carpe diem side of the reader and of Lesbia. Yes, and this is quite common in the themes of lyric poetry, which, as we discussed before, rebelled against the grander, more traditional styles. Yes, and I think this is notably evident in the middle section of the poem. Yes, I was hoping you would mention yes, when he goes on that tangent about kisses. Exactly, Dick. It's disastrously wonderful that you brought that up. Dami basia mille dende centum, den mil autora den secunda centum. Yes, and that goes on for quite a bit. See, these lines combine several key rhetorical devices that strike right at the heart of Catullus's message. Firstly, and most obviously, the anaphora of the dendes and danes combined with the asyndeton really emphasizes the repetition and the number of kisses that are stacking up for the two lovers. Yes, there does seem to be quite a bit of hyperbole in these statements. Yes, indeed. And in addition, and this sometimes goes a bit unnoticed, there's this repetition of the D sound that to the ear almost sounds pleading, begging. Yes, it does add a desperate tone, doesn't it? Yes, exactly. And when you combine that with the elisions, like in line 9, oh yes, that's dendus qualtura mille. Yes, then continuously another 1,000. You really start to understand how he feels about Lesbia. Yes, so now let's compare this to the message of Horace's poem. You start to see some interesting differences. In Horace's opening lines, he says, Vi tasin muleo, me similis Chloe, quae renti pavidam montibus aviis matrem. You avoid me, Chloe, similar to a fawn, seeking the trembling mother in the pathless mountains. What do you make of that, Leopold? Well, I think it immediately establishes a quite different dynamic and tone from Catullus's poem, where he sort of has this mutual, let's forget the rest of the world and just focus on our love attitude. But here, there's no doubt that Horace is the pursuer while Chloe is the victim. Yes, I see what you mean. For example, he describes Chloe saying she et cordet genibus tremit, trembles both in her heart and in her knees. And while she is rather scared, looking for her trembling mother and whatnot, Horace describes himself as a tigris aspera Gaetulis leo, a rough tiger or a Gaetulian lion. Yes, it is quite predatory, isn't it, Richard? And this actually brings me to a dangerously interesting point, which is the idea of litotes and the formation of negative implication, as it were, that puts a lot of potentially malicious threats into the poem, although they may seem somewhat innocuous at first glance. So I'll just show you some examples here in the text. Well, in the first stanza, when Horace is establishing the metaphor of Chloe as the fawn, he says that she is not without empty fear of the winds in the forest. non sine vano ararum et siluimetu. This is really interesting because he could have simply said with a groundless fear, but he says non sine. I'm not sure I follow you, Leopold. Well, it's really rather a sneaky trick, Dick, for this litotes has an almost subconscious effect, for it puts the question in the reader's mind. Is her mother's fear really empty? Is her mother really just paranoid of harmless winds, or is there something more malicious waiting? And by something waiting, you mean other men, right? That's exactly right, Dick. And I think this motif of Horace as a sort of threat to his lover, and not so much a companion as Catullus, really drives home the whole poem as a discussion of women and the roles and insecurities and responsibilities they have imposed upon them as they enter adulthood. Yes, I'm glad you brought that up, Leopold, because I think this is where looking at the poems together really gets interesting. What do you mean, Dick? Well, if it doesn't offend you, Leopold, do you think I could read a quote that explains my point? Don't be silly, Dick. I don't think I'll ever be offended ever again. Not since the American Revolution. Okay, well, this quote is from William Tortorelli of Brigham Young University. He says, in Ode 1.23, Horace examines the insecurities and fears of a woman during the process of maturing. Chloe is compared to a fawn, which has lost track of its mother, and the poet employs imagery of the advent of spring to represent the physical landscape of Chloe's adolescence. Images of harmful beasts intrude upon the peaceful springtime locus, as she envisions the loss of self through consumption by lions or tigers, eliciting a portrayal of a girl torn between fear of her own and a sense of sexual maturity. That is astoundingly, gobstoppingly enlightening, Dick. But you see, Leopold, I would argue that this isn't just limited to Horace's poem. I would argue that in Catullus 5 there's a similar, albeit less invasive, theme. I argue that Catullus's poem could also be an exploration of sexual maturity, simply with a more carefree attitude. For example, when Catullus implores that Lesbia forget the opinions of other envious men, ne quis malus invidere possit, one could interpret it as an invocation for Lesbia to grow into her own person and love for no one but herself. In addition, Catullus describes his love with the language of finance. You know, when he talks about valuing the opinions of more strict old men, or the jealousy of men because of how many kisses they share? Yes, I think I understand now. You're saying that both poets, even though they use quite different tactics, are not simply trying to vie for love. They're actually exploring the role of women and their over-sexualization, while pleading for their respective lovers to live by their own rules, not by those of their mothers or their peers, and to come into their own as adults. That is my point, yes. Well, butter my biscuit, that's something worth percolating, isn't it? And that's what's lovely about lyric poetry, because behind this simple facade of delightful, delicate verse is really something truly meaningful and insightful. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. It really has been a pleasure having you on the show, Leopold. I do hope you come back sometime. I've had a deliciously perfunctory time myself, Dick, and I can't wait to be back. Well, folks, once again, this is An Evening with Richard Puffpaff. I'm Richard Puffpaff. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time.